I've been doing the Sunday morning slot at the Academy now for a few years. And finally, I get to do it on the Book of Revelation. In some ways, that title might be slightly misleading, given I'm going to be talking quite a bit about apocalyptic thinking through time, particularly the Christian apocalypse, everyone's favourite, certainly my favourite. So if you're looking for just an endless discursus on Blade Runner, you've come to the wrong place. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to explore the apocalyptic imagination. I want to sketch out some of its history, and above all, I want to look at what is distinct, I think, about the apocalyptic imagination in the West today. To do this, I want to look at how people have used the apocalypse to give shape and meaning to history, how societies, communities, and certain social strata have at certain times come to feel they are those, in the words of St. Paul, they are those upon whom the ends of the ages are come. And I also want to explore through the through the way in which people imagine the ending, the ending of the world. People have made a certain sense of that world, and I think this, after all, is what the Book of Revelation is all about. It's a form of sense making. Again, as I say, if you are expecting something that's going to immediately dive into sci-fi dystopias, you probably just step outside for 10 minutes. I'm going to be talking about the Book of Revelation. It's a form of sense-making, a way of giving a form, direction and meaning, I think, to historical experience, a way of revealing the truth of the world by imagining its ending. As I'm sure everyone knows, apocalypse does not mean world-ending catastrophe. The literal Greek title of the Book of Revelation is the Apocalypse of John. You can probably see why they changed the title, because the Apocalypse of John isn't particularly exciting. There are far more dramatic apocalyptic names than John. Anyway, they changed the title. It's the Book of Revelation. And of course, the apocalypse means revelation. The apocalypse is a revealing, it's an uncovering, an unveiling. It literally means to pull the lid off something. When the Book of Revelation was put together in the 1st century AD by someone, by this John of Patmos, this John, people are pretty uncertain about who exactly John of Patmos was. D.H. Lawrence calls him a second-rate mind, which is a little bit harsh. Anyway, at the time John of Patmos was putting together the Book of Revelation, the early Christians, I think, they were an imperiled sect. They were surviving under the thumb of the Roman Empire. They suffered awful defeats and persecution. And so good old John, drawing on a Jewish messianic tradition, on the Old Testament and on kind of Zoroastrian, is that how you pronounce it? I'm looking at Sandy here. Goodness me, I won't say that word again. Anyway, that certain strand of Persian apocalyptics, John effectively imagines the destruction of the oppressive worldly power of Rome by a vengeful Messiah, a second coming of Christ as a warrior king with a sword in his mouth. Reading the Book of Revelation, it's often like it's written by a teenage boy. It's just, there's no subordinate clauses. It's just things happening, and there's the warrior king, and he's on a horse, and he's got a sword in his mouth, and he's got a slingshot. Anyway. So it details the righteous violence delivered, meted out by this warrior king. This righteous violence visited upon the worldly power, on the Roman Empire in its revealed forms of the Antichrist, the whore of Babylon, the beast, and so on. And this isn't just a revenge fantasy. Through its ending, through the depiction of the ending of the world as it then was, the moral truth of the world, of who is really good and evil, stands revealed. The institution of the millennium, the worldly power of Rome has been punished and the virtuous Christian martyrs rewarded. Before right at the end, God issues the last judgment, and at this point the true meaning and value of every being and everything stands revealed. Then all souls can head off to heaven. The end, good night Jerusalem, it's all over, gone. Now, the Book of Revelation has been subject to all sorts of kind of semi-occult reading, and it lends itself to that. It's texts laid upon other texts, from potentially different sources. There's lots of numerology at work. There's 7 seals, 7 churches, the number of the beast, etc., and so on. So people are always trying to interpret that. They're always saying, what can these numbers possibly mean? How can they match up with history and so on? Yet, as richly symbolic and elusive as that all is, it's pretty clear what the Book of Revelation is and what it means. It is the imaginative expression of the social situation of the early Christian sects. It's an expression of their desires, their hopes for vengeance and for redemption. forget good old John, forget John of Patmos. He of the unremarkable name, the second-rate mind, as D.H. Lawrence put it. The Christian apocalypse is born on the battlefields of Palestine. As no less a Joseph Frederick Engels said, it is gritty, combative, free of the dogma of later Christianity. As Engels puts it, it is animated by an eagerness for struggle and a certainty of victory. It shows, in other words, how those early Christians, in spite of all the persecution, as Engels says, nay, even spurred on by it, forge victoriously, irresistibly ahead. That is the social, political dimension to the Christian apocalypse, the ending which reveals the direction and meaning of history at the beginning of the first millennium. It is forged in opposition to an existing oppressive imperial power, and it works by unveiling, by revealing the evilness of existing power through the imagining of its destruction. It promises that wrongs will be righted, that defeats will be redeemed, and it promises a new golden age, effectively, by projecting Christianity's own ecstatic millennial triumph into the future. And the Christian apocalypse, I think, always has this kind of revolutionary charge, this yearning for change, and bear that in mind when we talk about the contemporary apocalypse. There's a yearning for change. There's bring it on. It's a text opposed to the world as it is. That's why after Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman world in the 4th century AD under Emperor Constantine, the book of Revelation then poses a problem, because it's a book promising the destruction of the very world empire of which Christianity is now the religion. And so there are various attempts to downplay and warp its meaning from that point onwards. I think St. Augustine effectively claims that it's actually a work of history, that all this has already happened or whatever, we can put this all to bed. We're now living in the new millennium and so on. I'm not going to go into all that because I don't know enough, to be honest. I think that's the main reason why I don't want to go into the way in which the book of Revelation was reinterpreted by Christians in the 4th and 5th century. Anyway, from this point on, I think from the moment that Christianity becomes an established church, established religion of the Roman Empire, the Christian apocalypse acquires a kind of subterranean existence as part of popular religion, rather than a kind of clerical religion. There are other apocalyptic texts which are kind of added to it. I think it's called the Sibylline Chronicles, Oracles, for instance. And in the 12th century, there's an Italian theologian called Joachim de Furore, who gives the Christian apocalypse an influential reworking. He claims that there are three stages of history which match the Holy Trinity. And the third stage of which, and this is key, the third stage of which, one of rapt ecstasy, effectively, Joachim claimed that was fast approaching. So that was coming down the line. There's a new apocalypse on the way, lads, and it's going to be great. So it's around about this time, during the 12th and 13th centuries, that the apocalyptic imagination starts to seize minds once again in kind of relatively large numbers, largely in Northern Europe. As historians Norman Cohn in The Pursuit of the Millennium, and I think in Christopher Hill as well in The World Turned Upside Down, the Christian apocalyptic at this point is once again worked up in the service of kind of marginalised social strata at odds with the existing order. So it flourishes against the backdrop of the Crusades, particularly the Paupers' Crusades. It flourishes against the backdrop of religious dissent. And it flourishes principally amongst those whose way of life is breaking down at this point in the 12th and 13th centuries under kind of new commercial pressures. That's why the millenarian movements of that time, they emerge in the most developed areas of Europe, in northeast France, Flanders, and along the Rhine. Because it was taking off, if you like, among a growing population of people whose traditional ways of life, rooted in centuries-old custom and so on, were being disrupted. So it was taking off among kind of discontented peasants, journeymen and unskilled workers living precariously, among vagabonds. People don't really talk about vagabonds anymore anyway, but anyway, among vagabonds, beggars and so on. And they will have felt, much as the early Christians did, that the end of ages had come upon them, that the world was ending. They had a sense of the change in the air because it was deeply affecting them. And so they looked to make sense of it all. The monasteries were too remote, the clergy were too worldly, too busy having sex, apparently. And so they looked to the apocalypticism of early Christianity, the purity of early Christianity once more, now preached, I think, by wandering, sometimes Hamitic preachers operating outside the church. And from that moment on in the late 12th century, there's an assortment of millenarian sects forming, right through to the explosive moment of the Reformation and into the English Civil War. And again, like their early Christian forebears, this version of as it did for their early Christian forebears, this apocalypse, the Christian apocalypse, revealed the truth of their world again through its ending. Invariably this time, invariably the Roman Catholic Church is cast as evil, and the Pope is the Antichrist. Unfortunately, Jewish people as well were often cast as the Antichrist as well at this point. Assorted preachers would pose as the second coming. Certain figures, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, for instance, was cast as the new Messiah. So the figures, the tropes of the book of Revelation are being worked up and reapplied to the medieval world. But there are other kind of distinctly medieval additions to the apocalyptic narrative at this point. Many preachers started talking of a restoration of a state of natural equality, of the sinfulness of bondage and servitude, as English preacher John Ball did during the 14th century English Peasants' Revolt. And more explosive still, there's the likes of Thomas Müntzer during the German Peasants' Revolt of the 1520s. And he argues that no Christian is entitled to hold any property exclusively for himself, that community of property is the only proper state for a society of Christians, and that all men are equal before God, so they ought to be on earth also. So the apocalypse is still playing a similar role to that which it did for the early Christians, revealing the truth of worldly power through the projection of its imminent destruction. There were still last emperors, messiahs, beasts, whores of Babylon, and so on. But this time, there is also the promise of redemption in this world, in a world that was soon to be turned upside down. So there's this yearning for a kind of this worldly change at the heart of that kind of the thriving of the apocalyptic during the Middle Ages. And in some ways, I think the flourishing of millenarianism during the Middle Ages, the expansion of the Christian apocalyptic imagination, put it to its high point in the 15th and 16th centuries. I think this is almost at the high point of the religious form of the Christian apocalyptic. So from this point onwards, from the Enlightenment onwards, really, the empowerment of human reason defangs the Christian apocalyptic. The development of properly historical thinking, of potentially revolutionary thinking, secularizes that sense of historical change, which is almost only grasped in terms of a kind of theological frame. A projected future may still shed light on the present, much as it does in the apocalyptic narrative. But that projected future in the apocalyptic, is now one to be made by man. So you see almost like the humanizing of, if you like, of the apocalyptic narrative. The Christian apocalyptic, I think, does persist into modern times as a source of kind of political rhetoric, indeed of politicized evangelism. Everyone knows, I don't know much of the Bible, but I'm aware of all the different kind of tropes and figures of speech that you find in the book of Revelation. Everyone knows about the whore of Babylon and the beast, the number of the beast. These things are just a kind of still active, living kind of figments of a kind of popular imagination. And I think the Christian apocalypse does kind of persist into modern times as a source of kind of political rhetoric, indeed of politicized evangelism. It's the motivational core, I think, if you like, of Christianity as a popular religion. So in his 1930 work Apocalypse, D.H. Lawrence writes of the popularity of the book of Revelation among the working class communities of Nottingshire's mining towns. He writes at the huge denunciation of kings and rulers, of the wicked rich of London, Paris, New York, and how they're cast of whores of Babylon. And he talks about how well this goes down among a Tuesday evening congregation of colliers and colliers' wives on a black winter night in a great barn-like Pentecost chapel. So if you're looking for the Christian apocalypse now, I'd suggest get yourselves up to Mansfield. I think that's the way to go. But it's no longer a social force anymore, I don't think. The Enlightenment, and I think its radicalisation, its humanisation, certainly among the working classes in the shape of socialism and Marxism during the 19th century, and the growing preponderance, if you like, of human reason over human affairs. All this thoroughly undermines that old Christian apocalypse. It takes away its force, it takes away its necessity. It starts to cast it as anachronistic. And yet, and I think this is crucial to, and now we get on to finally the contemporary, and I think this is crucial to our understanding of the current apocalyptic malaise. I would argue that while modernity undermined the social basis and spiritual appeal of the old Christian apocalyptic, it gives rise to a distinctly modern apocalyptic imagination, one whose social basis is not the agricultural poor or a persecuted sect or kind of marginalised social strata living precariously in medieval society. It's not the working classes and so on. The social basis of the modern apocalyptic imagination, I think, it's an elite basis. It's the social elites of certainly the late 18th, late 19th, and it's their slow motion turn against the modern world, their disillusionment, if you like, with the project of enlightenment. And it ends up casting the promise of modernity, casting that itself as infernal, as potentially a source of doom. There's a very youthful commentator I can hear somewhere in there. It's good to have that audience to and fro. You can see this. I think you can see the emergence of this very modern apocalyptic, this dark shadow, if you like, of the Enlightenment. And you can see it stirring in the 18th century in the shape of Thomas Malthus's essay on population. This is famously a work in which the lisping reverend tries to reveal the folly of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, by projecting demographic catastrophe over population into the future. Interestingly, I think this is one of the earliest examples of that kind of statistical apocalypse, which we see so frequently today. Whereby the present is condemned in light of a statistically modelled ending, and just as Malthus is proved to be catastrophically wrong, so many of these statistically modelled apocalypses of today do tend to get things a little wrong. You also get a sense of the turn against the Enlightenment and the kind of the blooming of a kind of modern apocalyptic in that kind of romantic critique of reason, science, and progress. So it's there, for instance, in the kind of the anxious imagining of a future race of man-made brutes eclipsing their human creators in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Again, it's almost like a proto-AI apocalypse narrative. It's always, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is always the book, it's always the reference point for anyone wanting to oppose scientific development today. And I think it's there also, probably more interestingly, or more interestingly, in Lord Byron's poem Darkness, in which he imagines a future in which the sun has disappeared, nature is dying, and humanity, far from adhering to the enlightened dreams of reason and brotherhood, is literally consuming itself. Cannibalism is always it's always a typical feature of any kind of post-apocalyptic scenario. At some point, in some post-apocalyptic disaster movie, someone would try to eat another person. I can guarantee it. Strikingly, it should actually be remembered that both Frankenstein and Darkness were written during an actual climate catastrophe. A volcano had erupted in Indonesia in 1816 and it had thrown so much ash into the air that sunlight was effectively diminished for 3 or 4 years. I can't remember which year it was. I think it might be 1818. I think it's described as the year without a summer, which is actually certainly in England right now. But the openly reactionary kind of proto-David Attenborough apocalyptics of people like Thomas Malthus and the kind of romanticist unease with aspects of early industrial society were just a foretaste. I would argue that the modern apocalyptic really starts to develop towards the end of the 19th century as European cultural elites start to turn strongly against modernity and enlightenment. It's a complex moment, and I almost don't want to spend too much time going into it. So I just want to put very crudely, I think what you get amongst a section of Europe's cultural elites at this point is a strong reaction against, this is towards the end of the 19th century, a strong reaction against socialism, Marxism, which have almost by the latter half of the 19th century almost started to pose as the heirs to the Enlightenment. So you have a reaction against these movements which are seen as a threat, which also turns into a reaction against the Enlightenment. And the modern apocalyptic at this point is also pitched against the masses, I think, as well, in inverted commas, who are demanding more suffrage, more power, more control over their lives. Because there's a sense developing amongst Europe's cultural elites at this point that this is where reason and progress has got us. This is the problem it's caused. This is where society is going. This is how society is going to end. So they start to imagine society in terms of its decay, its decadence. The word decadence is a kind of a staple of late 19th century literature. Actually, in a book of the same title, or rather translated as Degeneration, the social critic Max Nordau, this is in 1892, he writes, "It is as though the morrow could not link itself with today, things as they totter and plunge." So there's a sense amongst Europe's cultural elites towards the end of the 19th century, and it develops and deepens, that society is that society is ending, that the modern world is approaching its end, that it's decaying, it's going wrong. And what you see in developing in high cultural circles almost before the First World War and then exploding after it, is that sense of an ending, which is so prevalent today. That sense that the society in which these intellectuals, artists and so on, that society can't go on. The old is dying and the new is struggling to be born. That kind of that Antonio Gramsci quote, which is probably now just a Twitter meme. Many, like Gramsci, looked to communism, but others, like Ezra Pound, an English-American poet, of course, he famously implored artists to make it new, and he lurched towards the distinctly apocalyptic creed of fascism. In fact, everywhere you look during that crucial interwar period, this species of elite apocalypticism is flourishing, this sense that modern society is destroying itself. W.B. Yeats, of course, famously was to proclaim his support for Italian fascism, even indulged in a bit of Christian apocalypticism in his 1919 poem, The Second Coming. So things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And then Yeats anticipates a rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouching towards Bethlehem to be born, which is one way to talk about Benito Mussolini, I think. Rough beast. So that's how so Yeats is anticipating something almost catastrophically new approaching, right? So I think this is, The Second Coming, again, it's just of that moment. It's this poem which is just fueled by this sense of an ending. And I think what's important about this interwar moment is that it starts to turn the idea of crisis, this idea that this sense of an ending, this sense of transition, this sense between a past and a future, the past which is dying, the future which is to be born, it turns it into a semi-permanent condition. So it means that the end times are forever upon us. And I think it's best thought of, this moment, best thought of as a kind of temporal disintegration. I know Frank's touched on it yesterday, but you start to get the seeds of it at this moment, this temporal disintegration, in which the present bears no intelligible relationship to the past, which is decaying and antediluvian, it's out of date, and no predictable relation to the future, which is uncertain. There's a new to be born, but it's struggling to be born. People imploring it to be new, imploring society to make things new. The only continuity at this point is almost the only continuity is the sheer successiveness of crisis after crisis after crisis. Crisis just starts to be experienced by a certain elite sector of society as a permanent condition. And I think this very modern apocalyptic sensibility is captured best actually by the left-wing critic Walter Benjamin on the concept of history, where he writes of his own invention, effectively, which is based on a Paul Klee painting, The Angel of History. He writes, the angel of history's face is turned towards the past. This, by the way, is written in 1938, 1937. I think it's one of the last things Walter Benjamin ever wrote before he killed himself. Fleeing the Nazis, in fact. Anyway, so he writes, his face is turned towards the past. The angel of history's face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed, but a storm is blowing in from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such a violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Now, here I think Benjamin captures, the key components of the kind of modern apocalyptic imagination. From the perspective of this angel, that human history itself starts to appear as a catastrophe. What has long been regarded, for much of the 19th century as progress, now stands revealed as just an ever-growing pile of debris. Historical change, development, moments of progress, moments of regress, none of this has any meaning from this kind of new apocalyptic perspective. It's just one long trail of disaster. Now, drawing attention to this moment, my point in drawing attention to this elite cultural disillusionment with modernity, roughly sort of 100, 150 years ago, its profound rejection from both the modernist left and right during the interwar years, is the way in which it fuels and inspires the modern apocalyptic imagination. It frames it. It gives it this kind of shape which will develop. I think it's important to note that the modern apocalyptic imagination, the modern apocalyptic imagination precedes its actual content, the things which assume the looming threat. So the apocalyptic imagination precedes the nuclear bomb, it precedes climate change, or whatever. It provides the way in which these things will be interpreted. and it's a key point, I think, in modern history. It's the point at which human history starts to appear as the mistake, as the wrong turn. The point at which reason, it's too scientific, it's too instrumental, it's too technological. It's the point at which that starts to appear as the source of our self-destruction. The point at which human history, as I say, starts to appear as a man-made catastrophe. This is the moment, I would argue, that modernity itself starts to appear apocalyptic. The point at which the modern enlightened idea of history is open and subject to human intervention. The idea of history almost as a space for progress, as growth, space for growth, a space for hope even, becomes, or is turned into its opposite. It's turned into a space for the unfolding catastrophe of man's own unwitting making. It's fair to say, I think, by the late 1940s, the apocalyptic imagination is no longer just the preserve of artists, intellectuals and fascist politicians. Obviously, it's bolstered by two catastrophic world wars, the collapse of kind of laissez-faire liberal capitalism. As a result, the apocalyptic imagination, effectively, it flourishes among Western elites and increasing Western middle classes, I think, more broadly. Because it always looks paradoxical. After the Second World War, Western societies are becoming richer. They're more comfortable than they've ever been, of course. But at the same time, Western elites, seem increasingly anxious. Western society seems increasingly anxious. Western elites seem increasingly to lack the kind of moral and cultural belief in themselves that they once had. They're struggling to orient themselves at this point in terms of a past that was regarded, as Benjamin had it now, as catastrophic by almost everyone. And so disoriented and discertain, the future itself starts to loom up, I think, before them as a source of myriad potential threats. So this widespread sense of an ending, this widespread sense of a kind of modern apocalyptic, of course, famously attaches itself most notably to the atomic bomb. In some ways, at this point in the kind of 1950s, this is the perfect metaphor for modernity's capacity for self-destruction. It's the perfect sign of the man-made catastrophe to come. The philosopher Karl Jaspers said the bomb promised the real possibility of the end of the world. And of course, in 1947, the infamous doomsday clock appears on the cover of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists for the first time. And that suggests, of course, that humanity is just always a few minutes away from midnight, a few minutes away from the end of the world. And since 2007, it's always worth remembering that the doomsday clock now incorporates climate change, just to speed up that ticking hand. But the modern apocalyptic imagination, almost during the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's imagining modernity's capacity for self-destruction all over the place. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is a kind of doom-laden take on the impact of pesticides, so widely regarded as a kind of cornerstone of the kind of modern ecological movement. That's published in 1962. The following year, I think one of the first groups of scientists to associate man-made global warming with significant danger held a conference in New York. So almost by the 1970s and 80s, the ubiquity of the apocalypse was an accepted fact that everywhere people are talking about the disaster. The apocalypse is on the tips of people's tongue. Susan Sontag first noted it in the 1960s when writing about the vogue for sci-fi disaster movies, and again in the 1970s and 80s when she was writing about illness and AIDS. Western society, Sontag argued, always seems to be anticipating a world-ending disaster now. She said that public discourse was dominated by the sense that this or that danger, this or that problem was always leading or pointing towards that which she called the all-out catastrophe, the world-ending moment. Oceans, lakes and forests were supposedly dying. Population was reported to be growing to unsustainable levels. Think of Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. And the punctured and depleted ozone layer, which certainly haunted the imaginations of every kid during the 1980s, that promised to irradiate the Earth. As she put it famously, it was apocalypse from now on. So we've been living in the end times, if you like, for quite a long time. We've been living in the end times for quite a long time. We're living in a time when modern society seems incapable of justifying its continued existence, when its leaders almost seem to have given up on it to an extent, given up certainly on the legacy and legacy modernity and any sense of continuity with the promise of modernity. But I think there is something very distinct about the apocalyptic imagination right now. So when Sontag was writing, say, 4 or 5 decades ago, indeed when Christopher Lasch in 1979 wrote that warnings, portents, hints of catastrophe haunt our times, there was a sense that disaster, the end, was imminent, that it was approaching, it's always approaching them. But today, I would argue that the catastrophe, the end by which modernity should be judged, is no longer felt to be imminent, and this is kind of Frank Commode's point in the sense of an ending. No, it's felt to be immanent. The catastrophe is no longer in the near future, it inheres in the present itself. Every moment, if you like, right now, seems to be packed with a kind of eschatological sort of energy. Our very existence today is catastrophic, or always points to or references catastrophe. The apocalypse is no longer that which comes towards us, as it was in the Christian apocalyptic, and it was to an extent in the kind of the early modern apocalyptic. The apocalypse is already here. The present itself, if you like, is now framed as the site of an unfolding apocalypse. Now, this is most obvious. This is most obviously the case in terms of the main apocalyptic narrative of our time, which is climate change, global warming, or global boiling, as it's now being called since last week. It's not a future catastrophic event. It's a process, a catastrophe without an event, as one cultural critic calls it. It's a perpetual crisis, an ending without terminus and a terminus without ending. The world is not about to end. It's already always in the process of ending. So you have, and it's reflected politically. You have cities and nations which have already declared so-called climate emergencies because it's now, it's happening, it's upon us. The end's not just around the corner. We are living in the end times. Every weather event, from wild forest fires to, a hot June weekend in Brighton, is a sign of the catastrophe to come. A sign of the catastrophe that is with us right now. As a Guardian feature had it a couple of years ago, the climate disaster is here. The Earth is already becoming unlivable, which is one way to describe Brighton. The apocalypse is now in the present tense. Our house is on fire. That's how Greta Thunberg put it. It's not the house is about to catch fire. It's blazing away. Extinction Rebellion indulges in the same kind of present tense apocalypse. Extinction Rebellion founder Roger Hallam put in his book Common Sense. It bears no relation to Thomas Paine's classic, I have to say. He says it's time to grow up and see the world as it is. And ever eloquent, Hallam says, the world is fucked. So that it's really insightful stuff. You should really, I recommend it to know. Climate change, then, is the apotheosis, I think, of the modern apocalyptic. If you like, if the nuclear bomb was the kind of perfect symbol of man-made, of man's capacity for self-destruction, climate change is the means by which today's deletes almost disavow the whole of modernity, the means by which they presented, as Walter Benjamin did 100 years ago, as an unfolding, never-ending catastrophe of progress reconceived as just the piling up of environmental debris, just wreckage upon wreckage upon wreckage. And you can see it's just such a part of sort of political discourse. It's sort of unavoidable. Think of then Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking at COP26. He actually said that the invention of the steam engine by burning coal 250 years ago was the moment the doomsday device began to tick. This was the leader of a developed Western nation, which has benefited from the achievements of modernity, saying that modernity is essentially catastrophic. It's a process of catastrophe. And I think it should be clear by now, it should hopefully be clear now, how different the modern apocalyptic imagination is from that Christian precursor, which I talked about at the start. The Christian vision, if you like, was fueled by kind of bottom-up, it's not a public school joke, but bottom-up resistance to worldly power. It yearned for change, and it promised a redeemed future. The modern version, I think, is fueled by an intense elite disillusionment with the forces of modernity. It presents change not as something that is wanted, as something just as inherently catastrophic. It yearns, as Luke Gittos said yesterday, just to stop oil. And of course, it doesn't promise a redeemed future. It promises a post-human future. It promises no particular future at all. Indeed, if you look at the kind of post-apocalyptic dystopias, if you look at the kind of post-apocalyptic sort of vision, which is pretty popular right now in popular culture, from shows like The Walking Dead to The Last of Us, which I think is on, which is a relatively big show right now. These shows present no human future at all. They're set against backdrops consisting of buildings which are just being overtaken by nature, by foliage, by ivy growing up walls. And against this backdrop, we just see sort of we see the last survivors. They are the last men. Last survivors struggling forward to nowhere in particular. there's always the sense that humans are on the way out. And these shows allow us to sort of look back, if you like, on the catastrophe of human history and not to mourn it. In these visions, non-human nature is in the ascendancy. And again, you see the distinction. The Christian apocalypse, say what you like about it, the Christian apocalypse was a human apocalypse. The modern one, despite its supernatural agency, the modern one is thoroughly anti-human. It looks forward to the end of man. It even adopts, in some kind of sort of more kind of philosophical or academic treatises, it even adopts the pseudo-geological standpoint of the so-called Anthropocene, in which catastrophic human history is grasped as little more than a matter of geological record, a catastrophe which can be safely consigned to the past. Now, I'm going to end. Frank avoided ending on a miserable note yesterday, and that's even more miserable. So, I think what's important to grasp is that the apocalyptic imagination, because it precedes the specific fears which it frames, because it's the apocalyptic imagination sort of fuels those things that we should be scared of. It frames the way in which we should interpret the present. But it's not. You don't need to obsess about or argue over climate science or whatever to start challenging it. It's almost like a cultural, political battle, I think, with the apocalypse, battling the contemporary apocalyptic imagination. It means, it means defending a certain sense of continuity with the past. It means stopping regarding the past as just a litany of catastrophic misadventures, as just a record of man-made catastrophe. So I think there was almost grasping the way in which the apocalyptic imagination is the thing to be challenged actually makes it something that's easier to challenge, because it means you don't then just get dragged down into debating the particular merits of this or that scare, I think. This is, in some ways, it's part of the culture war, this moment. So that's my way of ending more positively rather than such a downbeat, doom-laden note when we just envisage the end of man, which, I'll be honest with you, I don't think it's true. That's my upbeat ending.